Hey lash artists, so today we're going to be talking about lash layers and lash rows. Some people call it layers, others call it rows. So either way, this is actually essentially the same thing. So on this channel, we try our best to actually educate and support you. So that's why you should actually subscribe to our channel and make sure to watch the next videos that we're going to have. So also make sure to watch until the end, because we're going to actually be showing two different techniques on how you can tape the layers and work smoothly with your lash layers. Okay, so what are layers or lash rows, and why is it important to actually be able to work with them in a organized way? So I'm going to show you guys an image here. As you can see, these are lash rows. Most clients will typically have from 1 to 4 layers or rows. Some clients will have more, others will have less, depending on the thickness of their lashes. So it's really important to actually be able to work with rows, because it's going to save you so much time, especially when you're working with really complex sets like volume and mega volume. They will actually save you time to be able to isolate them. The other important factor on why you should actually know how to work with rows is because you actually really want to avoid stickies. Stickies will make your work look really kind of messy and unclean. So actually isolating whichever section you're working in correctly will ensure that that doesn't happen. The other really important factor that you should always be aware of is direction. So when you're doing any set, it's really important to be aware of direction. So working in systematically in layers will ensure that your lash direction looks symmetrical, and that it all looks like it's going in the same direction. So this is actually, those are all the reasons why you typically should be working systematically with rows, and why you should know what those rows are. So rows are actually important in mega volume and volume. However, with classic, it's also, with the classic technique, it can also be used. So typically with volume and mega volume, you will be using working with rows much more often. So I'm going to show you guys a video right now on one of the taping techniques, and so that you guys can see firsthand all the steps that are required in order to do a lash taping and tape rows. So now that you guys saw the video on the taping technique, I just want to mention something. It's important to pick the correct tape when you're working, when you're taping the lashes. Make sure that the tape is not too sticky. The best tape to use would probably be paper tape. That tape is actually really good because it will ensure that the tape will come off really gently as you're peeling it off the lashes. Make sure you're actually also holding the lashes as you're pulling the tape off, because you don't want to pull off your client's lashes that you just did. So that's the one thing to keep in mind when you're doing this technique. So now the next thing we're actually going to talk about right now is sequence. So a lot of lash artists ask, what is the actual sequence that we should work those rows in? Where do I start? On which side? So there's actually a couple of different techniques that you can use. And then on this image, we're actually going to show those 3 techniques. They're numbered from 1 through 3. So the first technique is actually called the express technique. Typically, you would use this technique when you are pressed on time. So if you have clients booked one after another, if you're pressed for time or your client is pressed for time, you can typically use this technique. It's really good for sets that don't take that much time, like hybrid or classic, or a light volume as well. Typically will take about 1.5 hour to sometimes 1 hour and 45 minutes. With this technique, what's important is you're actually gonna start with the inner and outer corners of the lashes first, and you're gonna basically fill them up one after the other. You're gonna do inner corner, outer corner, inner corner, outer corner, and followed by the middle of the client's lashes, the midline. You're just gonna fill up the midline as much as you can, but the most important thing to remember is to really ensure that you fill up those inner and outer corners in order to ensure that it looks like a really nice full set. So the second technique is actually the by the book technique. So this technique typically takes about 2 to 2.5 hours. In this technique, we'll be working from the inner corners to the outer corners. So you're gonna do the inner corners first, followed by the midline of the eye, finishing off with the outer corners. This technique is actually really good for volume sets. It can also be used for mega volume sets, and it's usually like a very, very good technique for intermediate artists. They can use this technique often. Now, the third technique is the row by row technique. This is actually the most complex technique. It will typically take 3 to 3.5 hours, depending on which set you're doing, if you're doing a volume or a mega volume set. You can use it for both. You will typically start with the outer corners first, and then you will continue on to the midline of the eye, finishing off with the inner corners. So the inner corners are actually one of the most challenging areas for most lash artists. So this is a technique that's that is often used for artists that are actually pretty advanced, because inner corners are fairly easy for them, so they don't mind finishing with the inner corners. Now we're going to talk about placement for lash layers and rows. So the bottom lash row is actually the row that is furthest away from the lash artist, closest to the client. So on that lash row, it's actually really important that you place your lash fan on the top, not on the bottom, because if you place it on the bottom, you can actually have a lash drooping situation where the extension actually droops into the client's eye, as you can see on this picture. So in order to avoid this from happening, it's best to always consider placing the fan on the top of the client's natural lash. For the middle lash row, it actually doesn't really matter, because the top lash layer and the bottom lash layer will be covering the actual the placement. So you can either place it from the top or ideally from the side, and it won't really show. So you can do either or, and it won't really make a difference. Now, for the top lash row, it's actually ideal to place the fan from the bottom. The reason you want to place your lash extension fan on the bottom of the client's natural lash is because you really want to ensure that it looks clean from the top when the lash artist is going to brush the client's lashes. It's not the brush is not going to get caught in the extensions, and when the client is brushing his lashes, her lashes or his lashes, they're not going to get caught on the brush as well. So ideally you should put the fan on the bottom of the natural lash, from the bottom. So now we're gonna actually have a bonus video for you guys, which is how to isolate the lash layers with patches. So the benefit of isolating with patches is that you don't have that tape that will actually be difficult to remove. It's actually really, really easy to isolate the layers with patches. The drawback is actually the fact that it's a little bit more expensive and you're using more product, so the the patches can be a little bit pricey. And so if you're using 3 or 4 or 5 of them per eye, it can be a little bit more expensive. But we just wanted to show you guys this technique as well, so you can have a couple of different techniques to choose from. So we'll show you that video now. Hopefully you guys found this video useful and you found it educational. I'd love to know what your takeaway was from this video. If you have any questions or clarifications that are needed, please write them in the comments below. We'll be sure to answer all of them. And if you guys have any other ideas that you have for future videos, please be sure to either message us or put it in the comments below as well. And don't forget to subscribe to see more videos like this in the future and similar types of content.